Well, hello, Mr. Fancy Pants.
Hail to the king, bitch.
Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror. Fatal Games by Bruce Richards. Chapter 19. It's coming from the basement up through the air vent, Chip said, standing motionless by the window. No kidding, Einstein, Al replied sarcastically, staring at the vent. Should we call the cops or something? Chip asked. Yeah, we could, Al said, finally moving from his spot on the futon and walking toward the air vent. If we had a phone. Chip walked over, got down on his hands and knees, and put his ear to the vent. There's someone crying down there. Crying? Al asked in disbelief. Hey, maybe your weird girlfriend came back, Al suggested. Why would she be crying in our basement? The same reason she was running around up here last night, Al said. The chick's nuts. Cute, but nuts. Chip stood up from the air vent. Well? Well, what? Should we go down there? Chip asked, or are you chicken? Al glared at his brother. Who you calling chicken? You, chicken. Chicken like the way you ran out on me last night. I was just goofing around, Al protested, trying to freak you out. Chip shook his head and rolled his eyes. He didn't buy that for a moment. For all his bravado, Chip knew his brother was insecure and easily scared. Chip picked up his jeans and sweater from the window seat and started to put them on. You going down? Al asked. I'm not going to hang out up here all night listening to a lot of moaning and groaning. Chip sat on the floor and laced up his sneakers, then left the room with Al behind him. He stopped in the kitchen and picked out the biggest, sharpest knife he could find. Then he headed for the basement stairs. Al was armed with his dumbbell. Chip's heart was thudding inside his chest. You ready? He whispered to Al over his shoulder. Yeah, Al said. Right behind you. Yeah, right, Chip thought, so you can make a quick getaway. They crept down the basement stairs. Chip held the knife in front of him. The door to Dr. Hawk's office was open. In the eerie red glow cast by the furnace fire, Chip could see someone sitting in the old examination chair with his back to them. He wore a hood. Against the opposite wall, outside the office, the rectangular basement window had been shattered, and moonlight ricocheted off the jagged shards of glass. A savage jet of flame shot out of the open boiler door, illuminating the figure sitting in the examination chair. A chill raced up his spine. It was the guy who had been in his room, the guy with the club instead of a right hand. Chip realized the butcher knife was shaking in his hand. His whole body was trembling. The hooded figure was now standing, stuffing things into the boiler fire with his left hand. Chip heard him sobbing softly. He was crying. Chip glanced back at Al, whose expression was a mixture of dread and curiosity. They walked slowly to the open office door. Chip felt something rub against his leg and uttered a startled cry. He glanced down and saw Maggie scurry away. When he looked back up, the hooded figure was spinning around to face him. Chip and Al gasped in horror. Although Chip had seen the hooded figure's face before, in the dim light of his room, it was even more hideous in the glow of the crackling fire. The ugly gash that ran diagonally across his face was scabby, with bits of it peeling off, revealing pink flesh underneath. Part of his lip hung limply from his mouth, and the eye that hung down was moving around as if it had a life all of its own. The thing on his hand wasn't a club at all, Chip could now see, but a plaster cast. The deformed face was wet with tears. Chip's mouth dropped open as he fought back the revulsion he felt at the sight of the ghastly face. The whole scene was so bizarre, so grotesque. "What are you up to, buddy?" Al asked. The simple question in the outlandish setting sounded absurd to Chip. The hideous face stared back at them, speechless. Al flicked the office light on, and the face squinted. Then Chip realized who it was. Even though the face was horribly deformed, he could still recognize the boy. He remembered what he had looked like when he had played against him last year in the Middleton Springwood football game. It was Scott Martin. Chapter 20. "So, what's the story, Ace? Let's hear it," Al said, gesturing with the dumbbell. "Before I mess up what's left of your—" "Chill out, Al," Chip exclaimed. "That's Scott Martin, Springwood's ex-quarterback. You remember? He played against us last year and killed us." "Jesus." Al lowered his dumbbell, his mouth agape. He stared dumbfounded at Scott. "What happened to your face, dude?" "I was in a car accident," Scott said in a soft, lisping voice, tugging the hood tighter around his face, turning his head, keeping it in the shadows. "A car accident did that to your face?" Al asked in disbelief. "Hey, cool it, Al, huh?" Chip reproached his brother. "Have some pity." He turned his attention to Scott. "What happened, Scott?" "The accident was only part of it," Scott said in a bitter voice. "And Evan Walker was the other part." "Evan Walker? You mean the kid who used to live here?" Chip asked, setting the butcher knife down on Dr. Hawk's desk. He studied Scott's haggard, dreadful face. "Evan Walker did this to my face with a tire iron, just before he smashed the bones in my passing hand, crushed them. I'll never play football again." "See these?" Scott held what appeared to be several letters in his hand. "That's over to my girlfriend Alicia, beautiful girl. Never again. She could never deal with this face." "Alicia?" Chip remembered the letter jacket she had worn, probably Scott's. Scott's eyes glinted madly. Then he spun around in the examination chair and tossed the letters into the fire. Flames shot from the boiler, nearly licking his fingers. "There's something evil in this house," he rasped. "What?" Chip asked. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Scott said. His speech sounded odd through his ragged, misshapen lips. "I'm not sure I believe it myself." "Try us," Al said impatiently. Scott took a deep breath. "I was here the night of the murders, sitting in a parked car outside this house. I saw Alicia go inside with Evan. She was still blind then." "Blind?" Al interrupted. "Alicia was blind?" "She was blinded in the same car accident I was in," Scott said. He half turned in the chair. His profile was terribly abnormal. "Evan Walker's uncle was a retired doctor, and Alicia thought he could cure her blindness." Scott's expression darkened. "And I guess he must have, since she's no longer blind. The only thing is, it wasn't Dr. Hawk that helped her. It was—" A tongue of fire jumped out of the furnace. "An evil spirit," Scott finished. "You want to tell us about this evil spirit?" Al asked, obviously not buying into what Scott was telling them. But Chip was ready to believe anything. Maybe evil spirits would explain his nightmares. He leaned on the desk and his hand accidentally brushed against the handle of the butcher knife. The blade was swung round to point at Scott. "I spent a lot of time thinking about this," Scott rasped. "A lot of time. Trying to piece together the puzzle. That's why I came here tonight. The answer's here and I have to know." "That's what Alicia said last night," Chip said. She was looking for an answer. Scott's one good eye seemed to flash at the mention of Alicia's name. "Dr. Hawk had died weeks before the murders," Scott continued. "His heart stopped beating for several minutes, but he was revived. And then all the weird things started to happen." "What weird things?" Al asked. "A hit-and-run driver killed Alicia's neighbor, Tiffany Clark. and ran over my friend Boomer's legs. Ellen Sawyer was murdered, and then there was the accident that happened to me and Alicia. Scott paused for a moment, gathering his strength to continue. After I got Alicia out of there and they discovered the bodies in the furnace, the police found Dr. Hawk dead in his bed, like he had died in his sleep or something. But I think he had been dead all along. Scott's voice was low. Chip and Al had to lean closer to hear him. I think Dr. Hawk died that night when his heart stopped. That's when the evil spirit took over his body, Scott said in a harsh whisper. Chip felt a wave of fear sweep through his body. And now it's moved on, Scott continued in his pain-filled voice. Moved into a living body, at least. I think she's still alive. Chapter 21. Wow, Chip exclaimed, holding his hands up in protest. You don't mean Alicia? Chip swallowed hard. Do you? Scott turned to face Chip and nodded grimly. Chip shook his head with disbelief. Not Alicia. Not the girl he had kissed. How did you come up with this theory? Chip asked. I was parked outside this house the night when I heard her scream. I ran in and heard another scream coming from the basement. I ran down here and found Alicia strapped to this chair. The walls, there was blood all over them. Scott's voice trailed off. Chip looked at Al, who was staring at Scott as if spellbound. Alicia was here the night of the murders. Why hadn't she said anything about that? Was it too horrible to mention? Or maybe she had been in shock and didn't remember. Chip ran his eyes along the cold basement wall that had been part of Dr. Hawk's office. Strange shadows were being tossed about by the burning boiler fire. As Chip watched the shadows dance over the scarlet splatters, the blood turned liquid again and started to run down the walls. First in trickles, then more and more until it was like a crimson waterfall cascading down the wall across the floor. It was coming toward him, coming with such force it would surely knock him down and he would drown. Chip gasped and closed his eyes, but nothing happened. It was quiet suddenly. The only sound was the fire crackling inside the old furnace. Chip slowly opened his eyes again. There was no waterfall of blood. The room was as it had been before. Al and Scott were still talking about the murders as if nothing had just happened, as if they had not seen or heard the torrent of blood. Scott was staring into the fire. When I charged in, Alicia was screaming. The door in the furnace was wide open. I could see Tiffany and Ellen, the two murdered girls inside. They had been stuffed in so savagely their arms and legs were broken and tangled up. I saw their faces. They had no eyes, just empty sockets. Then as I watched, their flesh melted away. Scott's gaze turned upward. Evan had hanged himself from those pipes, or someone had hanged him. His eye sockets were also empty. Scott looked back at the fire. His mouth was a bitter gash. Alicia was strapped in the chair in the middle of a nightmare, talking to someone, only she wasn't blind anymore. So, how did she get her eyesight back? Al asked with a puzzled frown. Scott drew in a deep, ragged breath. Don't you get it? She was making a deal with the evil spirit to get her eyesight back. What deal? Chip asked. She let the evil spirit enter her, Scott exclaimed. It lives in her now. Chapter 22. The fire whooshed inside the furnace as a cold draft slipped in through the shattered basement window. No offense, Scott. Chip still felt a bit dazed. You've obviously been through a lot and all, but I think that what you just told me is a lot of crap. Suddenly, the boiler fire spat out a burning piece of paper. It floated lazily in the air for a moment before landing at Chip's sneakers. Chip looked down at it. He saw the words, "I'll always love you, Scotty. Alicia." Chip watched, hypnotized, until the charred piece of paper burned away to nothing. He was surprised by the strong pang of jealousy he then felt, and the powerful feeling of fear. "She's evil," Chip heard Scott say, in a voice that seemed 1,000 miles away. "Look, Scott," Chip began, "maybe you'd better go home and get some rest, and stop breaking into my house," he added silently. But Scott seemed to be listening to a different voice, a voice Chip could not hear. Scott was staring into the fire. "Look, dude," Al said, moving closer to Scott. "The party's over. It's time to—" A loud crash interrupted Al's words. "The evil spirit's here," Scott said, his warped face growing pale. Chapter 23. Chip suspected a more mundane explanation for the crash. "What's over there, Al?" Chip asked, nodding in the direction the sound had come from. I think it's a utility closet or something. Probably some mice or squirrels in there," Al said. "Maybe we should check it out," Chip suggested. "Don't go back there," Scott warned, his lispy voice growing shrill. "That's where the evil spirit lives." Ignoring Scott, Chip walked out of the office into the door next to it. He heard a scampering in the darkness. Maggie ran up to him. She rubbed her body against his leg. "Maybe you should send her in first," Al cracked from the office doorway. Chip grinned. He slowly reached out his hand and twisted the doorknob. The door opened onto a dark room. He hesitated for a moment. Nothing happened. Chip groped along the wall until he found the light switch and flicked. It was a cramped little room full of cleaning supplies, rusty gardening tools, and some paint cans that looked at least 100 years old. Some musty-smelling newspapers were stacked against one wall next to a pile of old magazines. Maggie darted into the room. She made her way to one corner and started chewing something off of McDonald's wrapper that was on the floor, a little hunk of hardened cheese. Chip heard a sound behind him. He shot a glance over his shoulder. Al had just stepped into the room. "Been eating in here, Al?" Chip asked as Maggie greedily finished off the cheese. I might have," Al said cryptically. Something caught Chip's eye. "Knock the light out for a second, Al." "What for?" "Just do it." The light went out and the room was dark. Chip detected a tiny pinprick of light in the wall that separated the office from the utility closet. He put his eye to it. It was a peephole. "Turn the light back on," Chip instructed Al. The light came back on. "Look there. You can see right into the office." Maggie had finished with the McDonald's wrapper and was now sniffing at the wall. Chip's eyes focused on the cat. Then he ran his hands along the wall where she was sniffing. He felt a cool draft. Chip glanced over his shoulder at his brother. "I think this part of the wall is fake." He tapped the wall with his knuckles. A hollow sound echoed back. Chip looked curiously at Al. "What do you think is back there?" Al shrugged. Chip started pushing on the wall, pushing on it where he could feel the draft coming through the barely perceptible cracks. A spider drifted down, swaying on the end of a strand, and landed on Chip's hand. Chip blew it away with a puff of air as he continued to push with all of his might. The door suddenly swung open, and Chip fell against it. He lost his balance and stumbled forward, into darkness. Chapter 24. A cold chill burst into the room. Maggie sprung backward as if she had been attacked. She darted back toward Dr. Hawk's office. "It's some kind of tunnel or shaft," Chip said, standing up and brushing himself off. Chip shivered from the cold and from the fear of what might be up ahead. "Where do you suppose it goes?" he asked Al. "Probably outside somewhere. How should I know?" "Someone's been here recently." "What do you mean?" "The food wrappers and stuff. Someone's been hiding in our basement, in this closet, going in and out this way," Chip said, motioning up the dark tunnel. It was as black as pitch. They could see only a few feet ahead. Chip took a step forward and his foot hit something soft. A repulsive screech made him leap back. Then something shot out of the darkness, something gray and furry and greasy looking, a very large rat. Chip yelped in surprise as he jumped in the air to dodge the slimy creature. Al gasped as the rat ran across his feet on its way out of the door. Chip looked back into the dark tunnel, then quickly closed the door. "I'll board the door up the first chance I get." "So where's that stupid cat of yours when we need her?" Al asked. "I'd say she's smarter than us," Chip said, glancing about for Maggie, but the cat had vanished. "Since she's gone and we're here getting scared to death by rats." Chip was silent for a moment, listening for the chittering of the rat. "Hey, Scott," Chip called. "Is that rat still out there?" There was no reply from the other room. "He probably ate it," Al cracked. Chip chuckled in spite of himself. "Hey, Scott," he called again. "You still there?" Still no answer. "He probably went through the basement window along with that rat," Al said. "Did you see where he broke our window?" "Yeah, I saw it," Chip said. "Yo, Scott!" It was as quiet as a coffin. "Scott, you out there?" Chip called again. "Why?" Al asked plainly. "Why is he doing all this?" "The same reason he's been spying on our house. The same reason he broke into the basement and came into my bedroom. The same reason he was stuffing Alicia's love letters into our furnace." Chip stopped abruptly when he heard soft footsteps outside the utility closet door. Maggie stuck her head in the door and looked curiously about. Chip and Al breathed a sigh of relief. "You were saying?" Al asked. "Huh? About all the reasons Scott did those things?" "Because he's nuts," Chip said simply. Al chortled. "Or maybe this house makes people nuts." "Yeah, maybe," Chip agreed. "I guess I'd be nuts too if I saw the things he saw down here the night he rescued Alicia. And by the way, who the hell are you talking to down here at night? It's bad enough you're down here clanking weights. Now your voice is coming up the vent as well?" "You're crazy," Al replied. "You're hearing things." "Scott!" Chip shouted for the last time. Chip walked out of the utility closet, scanning the dark corners and hidden shadows of the basement, looking for the rat. But there was no rat, and there was no Scott either. Both were long gone. The only sign of life was the fire crackling inside the furnace. Chapter 25. Monday afternoon at Springwood High, Chip was spinning his locker combination dial for the second time. Or was it the third? He couldn't remember. A new locker, new school, new classes, new teachers, new everything. Chip wore a light blue sweater over straight-legged black denim jeans. For some reason, the weather always seemed warmer away from Elm Street. It was so warm, in fact, he was tempted to take off his sweater and just wear his t-shirt. But the t-shirt he had put on that morning when he was still groggy with sleep was his old Middleton High t-shirt, and he didn't want to appear to be an outsider at Springwood High, especially not on his first day of school. He yanked down on his locker handle. It still wouldn't open. He tried spinning the dial again. Chip had spent most of Sunday afternoon cleaning the house and trying not to think of Alicia. He had gone to her house again on Sunday, but was met with the same cold reception as before by her mother. Her sullen-faced mother, who told him she wasn't home. And yet, when he left, he had glanced over his shoulder and thought he had seen someone looking out an upstairs bedroom window at him. Had Alicia told her mother to get rid of him if he came around? Chip yanked down hard on the locker door again, and again nothing happened. Out of frustration, he punched the door with the resounding clang that caused several students to eye him nervously as they walked by. Someone tapped him roughly on the shoulder. Chip spun around. The boy standing behind him was a huge guy with a gap in his front teeth. "You better have a good reason for trying to break into my locker, dude," the big guy said sharply. Chip glanced at the locker number, then turned and with embarrassment, "Sorry," he mumbled, sliding over a locker. "I guess I'm over here." He spun the dial of his locker as the big guy continued to stare at him. Fortunately, Chip was able to open his locker on the first try. Satisfied, the big guy opened his own locker. "You're Chip Parker, aren't you?" he asked, glancing sideways at Chip. "Yeah?" Chip said, a little surprised that the guy knew who he was. "My name's Charlie Chadwick. I played against you last year. I'm the guy who pushed your head down in the mud during a big pile-up," Charlie said bluntly. "Remember me? You had to leave the game for a play to clear the muck out of your mouth. You almost suffocated." "Oh yeah, that was you?" Chip asked, not sure how to react to Charlie's confession. "Are you going to try out for the team?" Charlie asked, yanking out a textbook and shoving another one in. "Yeah, this afternoon at practice," Chip said. "Me and my brother." "Al Parker?" "Yeah, I played against Al Parker 2 years ago," Charlie said. "On defense, he broke 2 of our halfbacks' ribs." "Uh-huh," Chip said. He didn't know what else to say. He hoped Charlie wouldn't punish him for what his brother had done. "Your brother can play some serious defense," Charlie said with admiration. Chip breathed a sigh of relief. So Charlie admired dirty tricks. He'd have to remember that. Charlie slammed his locker door shut. "I just wanted you to know that Scott Martin was the greatest quarterback the school has ever had, and no one will ever replace him. If you think you can just walk on the field and be our quarterback, you better think again, even if Roger Dawson does suck and Barney Peters throws like a girl." Charlie walked away, without another word. "Don't take him too seriously," came a voice from behind Chip. A kid in a wheelchair was at the locker on the other side of the hall. He twirled the dial on his combination lock with a practiced motion and easily flicked the door open, then turned his attention to Chip. "Charlie Chadwick thinks all quarterbacks should wear skirts." Chip smiled weakly. "My name's Boomer," the kid said, holding out his hand. Chip shook it. "Chip Parker, how'd you know I played quarterback?" "I played against you last year," Boomer said. "I played fullback." "Oh," Chip said, his eyes glancing down to the empty space beneath Boomer's knees where the rest of his legs should have been. "See you at the tryout," Boomer said. He pulled a book from his locker and placed it in his lap, closed his locker door, spun around nimbly on the back wheels of his wheelchair, and made his way expertly through the crowded hallway. He never looked back. Chip remembered Boomer from last year's game. Remembered that the guy had legs like tree trunks. Then he recalled that Scott had mentioned his friend Boomer. So Boomer was connected to this whole thing too. Chip found his biology textbook, closed his locker, and made his way down the hall. He wondered how Al was making out. They had shared an English class earlier that morning, which Al had slept through, but Chip hadn't seen his brother since. Chip had sat next to Barney Peters during third period math class. Barney was the second-string senior quarterback for the Springwood Owls, a tall, gangly boy with a smattering of pimples and the biggest feet Chip had ever seen. Barney was built more along the lines of a basketball team center than a quarterback of a football team. Chip had been friendly to Barney, but Barney had been kind of cool back, probably because he knew they would be competing against each other for the quarterback spot. Or maybe it was because he knew Chip lived on Elm Street. It seemed a lot of kids at school already knew who he was, or at least they knew he was the guy who had moved into Evan Walker's old house. He had already received more than his share of curious, sometimes fearful looks. Just one more class to go before the tryout, Chip consoled himself as he joined the flow of students in the hallway. He wished his throwing arm didn't feel like lead. He had slept on it in a funny position last night. He glanced at the room numbers, looking for the biology lab. He was on the wrong floor. He had to go down a flight. Chip joined the mob in the stairwell. He saw Al walking down the stairs ahead of him. "Al!" Chip called, but the boy didn't turn around. The kid looked like Al from the back, tall and broad-shouldered like Al, and wearing the same sweatshirt. He called again, but his voice was lost in the noise of the stairwell. Then Chip saw Barney Peters a few yards ahead of the hooded guy, tall and skinny. Barney was easy to spot. He was goofing with a couple of guys in leather jackets as the throng moved down the staircase. The hooded guy seemed to be forcing his muscular frame through the crowd, slowly making his way toward Barney. Chip felt a sudden stab of dread. "Al, wait up!" Chip bellowed at the top of his lungs. The boy in the hooded sweatshirt didn't turn, though he must have heard Chip's yell. Chip shouted again. A fat kid on the stairs in front of him turned around and shot Chip a nasty look. "My ears, dude," he said, sticking a pudgy finger in one ear. "Sorry," Chip mumbled, pushing past the kid, then some others. Chip ignored the curses tossed in his direction as he barreled through the crowd. He knew in his gut that if he didn't get to Barney before the kid in the hooded sweatshirt, something bad was going to happen. Something very bad. He had to get to Barney, had to warn Barney before the guy in the hood caught up to him. "Barney!" Chip called, but Barney didn't hear him either. Chip kept pushing his way through the crowd. The entire student body of Springwood High seemed to be between him and his goal. He was almost there, maybe 10 feet away, when he momentarily lost sight of both Barney and the hooded guy. "Barney!" Chip shouted. Barney spun around. He was just a few feet away, and then Barney was falling. Barney reached a hand out and Chip tried to grasp it, but he was too late. Barney hit the hard concrete stairs on his side, bounced hard, and hit the stairs again. His face slammed into the edge of a step with a sickening smack. Barney started rolling down the stairs, a spray of blood from his busted nose showering those around him. A shrill scream shot up from the onlookers, who tried to get out of his way. He finally came to rest in a tangled mess at the bottom of the stairs. His arms and legs twisted beneath his body. His jaw snapped open at a grotesque angle. His face a bloody pulp. A girl at the bottom of the staircase screamed, and then another. "Oh my God, he's dead!" Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, and 25 of Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror, Fatal Games by Bruce Richards. I'm really enjoying this book. I do regret the fact that I read this one for the channel before the first book in the series, Blind Date. I didn't realize that the first two books were so intertwined. Like when David Bergantino took over in book number 3, he just loosely based the books together, like maybe a slight mention of a character or something, but nothing major. But apparently this book just gives away everything that happened in the first book, and I apologize for that. But it does sound like an interesting story, and I will be narrating Blind Date very soon, probably right after I finish this one and Final Destination, Destination Zero. That way the entire series will be available from book 1 to 6. So I do apologize for any spoilers of Blind Date. I really did not know that this book was going to give away so much. This is my first time reading the entire series. But I am enjoying this one. I still prefer David Bergantino's books. But Bruce Richards is doing a good job with this narrative, keeping it going, making the characters interesting. Hey, we got out of the house. We've spent like 100 pages in the house, and now we're at school. And someone has died. Barney has died. Poor Barney. hey Fred, you know. Barney Rubble, yeah. Anyways, gruesome death, falling down the stairs, twisted, bloody mess. I'm curious to see what's going to happen after this, because it sounds like Chip was the closest one to him before he fell. Are people going to blame Chip? And what about Alicia? Why is she all of a sudden not coming around? Her mom acting weird. I mean, we don't have the whole backstory because we haven't read or listened to Blind Date yet. But I'm really curious to find out who it is that's possessed by Freddy. I have a feeling it's probably Al. It seems very obvious, but I mean, the hooded sweatshirt guy is the one that seemed to have pushed Barney. So it's got to be a guy, right? Because I was thinking it was going to be the mom, because she hasn't shown up yet. She hasn't been in the book at all. So either she's dead and they haven't realized it or found her yet, or she is the one possessed by Freddy. But I want to know what you guys think. If you're enjoying this book so far, what your guesses are on who's possessed by Freddy. If you've already read the book, please don't spoil it for us. But if you haven't and you want to take some guesses with me, I would love to hear them in the comments section below. I'll be back as soon as possible with many more chapters of Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror, Fatal Games by Bruce Richards. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening. Be excellent to each other. Check out the newest episodes of Slash Tracks and Slash Tracks Action News Podcast. It's a fun podcast where me and Alex talk about random stories from the internet, all genres, horror, comedy, just everything going on crazy in the world. The craziest stories you'll find, we discuss them, and we have a horror segment. It's a lot of fun. We have a brand new animated intro for it with a rockin' theme song. The animation was done by Alberto Hernandez Merida, who also did the animation you saw at the beginning of this video. And we have an awesome theme song for Slash Tracks Action News Podcast by a band named Moonsauce. So check it out, and I'll see you soon.